I had a conversation with a person from the government about this. And they said, well, you have nicotine in there. And then I said, what? You can buy a 4 milligram gum of nicotine, 400 pieces of them in CVS, and you won't bat an eyelash. And here it is, one troche has 1 milligram.
What's the average attention span of most people now? It's about like 2.5 seconds or something like that, right? So take some Blue Cannatine and it's going to increase your concentration, your focus for 3 to 5 hours. So that's going to help almost anybody that is living in the world where TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat are right on your phone.
I was really considering using a little bit of THC to increase awareness, to increase a little bit the norepinephrine effect. But, well, it's illegal, so.
Also, thank you for not doing it because it would have created a whole host of headaches around. Hi, I am from Delaware.
What do you do in Delaware?
Well, technically our company is based in Delaware, so we can use that as a segue into the first of our Behind the Formulation series, I guess is what we'll call it.
Get to have a good background music for it.
All right, let's get into this because what we want to do here is a deep dive behind the formulation, what went into particular formulations, the ingredient selection process. We can even get into the R&D process in certain cases.
This will be fun. Yeah.
This will be a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah.
And let's kick things off where it all started with Blue Cannatine. And I think somebody here originally, and I don't know how Troscriptions would have actually been a good name for a gum company, but can we get into the idea of Blue Cannatine as a gum and where did that all start? And I think that starts with the man, the myth, the legend himself, Dr. Ted.
I have been traveling so much for more than a decade. And the problem there is that when you land, you have to be on, right? And so I started thinking, why can't I formulate something for myself where when you land, you're actually on? So I started putting together what can energize my mitochondria, my neural mitochondria, and that was methylene blue. And then I said, well, I need to wake up, so I had to put caffeine in there. I need my short-term working memory in order because when you have jet lag, and that heaven for me is defined by being the same time zone for at least 2 weeks. I've been in hell all the time. That's why I was actually pushed to formulate this. So I need to get my working memory in order. And the forgotten nootropic, there was an old article in Scientific American magazine and a lot of articles actually on how it boosts short-term memory. Of course, it's a nicotinic acid and the people are so afraid of it. Well, it's just vitamin B3. I said, well, I need that burst of working memory. And then I put in some CBD in there because nicotine for me had a very sharp, pointy spike, right? But at the same time, it's also an anti-inflammatory. So it softened. The effect was very Adderall-like. Yes, I've taken Adderall. I know how it feels like. So it's a very gentle rise and then no crash, a gentle fall. And I said, where do I put this? I said, I want this to be in an all-natural resin, like the Sapodilla resin, right, for gum. And that's because I wanted to chew it so that it will be in the oral cavity, which will then be closer to the base of the brain and had a proper release in the mouth and not swallowed. I started making gum in my kitchen and I tried it. It was working for me. And my friends actually asked for it. And they said, well, Dad, why don't you manufacture this, make something out of it? So I did look for a manufacturer. And apparently when it's a gum, it's going to be made by a confectioner, right? I had this confectioner in Rhode Island and said, after looking at it, and it's like, wow, it works. I said, but we won't make it for you. I said, why not? It turns all of our equipment blue. So I had to go back to the chopping board and chop off the gum, right? And I said, what will allow it to actually melt while releasing the active ingredients and being close to the base of the brain circulation so that you could have the immediate effect? And that was the birth of the troche. I created it in troche form, and that was the very first product. And then, of course, from gum to troche within the compounding pharmacist purview, it became troche prescription. So transcriptions, right?
Yeah.
But
Gum scriptions,
Yeah.
gum
scriptions.
scriptions.
I have a fun story about when we transitioned over to the troche form, because I remember Ted and I, we've been using troches forever because of compounding pharmacies, but I never actually had one myself until like the first batch came to my house that were made by you. And I didn't remember that it was a troche, and instead I just bit into it. And I just got a massive headache. I was like, oh, what just happened? You're not supposed to bite into troches, and you're supposed to let them dissolve. It was a long process, actually, those first almost about a year or so doing R&D on Blue Cannatine, if I recall.
Yeah, that's because I really wanted it not to have any crash. I remember having a marketing person said, "Oh, this will never fly because it turns people's tongues blue." I said, "No, no, no. I'll prove to you that it won't. That this will fly." And a year later, she called me up and said, "Hats off to you." I said, "Well, blue is the new smart. If it works, people really do not care if it turns their tongues blue. And besides, if you really don't want to get your tongue blue, you can just swallow it. Except that the buccal mucosa has about 8 layers of mucosal layers in it, right? So that the actual dissolution time, the melting, releases it at the proper rates. This is not sublingual, although the shorthand for troche is like a lozenge, but you put in a buccal cavity. Technically, in pharmacy, when you say it's a lozenge, it's a sublingual lozenge, right? A troche is a buccal troche. And it's different that way because under the mouth, there's only one layer of mucosa, so absorption is very fast. So if you try to put it under your tongue, you'll get that jarring rise, right? And then the jarring crash. And
or if you try to take a bite of it, like I did. So,
yeah.
Not the old MacGyver approach.
Yeah. I remember also, we actually even tried other things other than CBD in there for a little while too. I think we tried L-theanine as well for a little while, but the problem with that was it just too big, too many milligrams per dose to have the same effect as CBD. I can't remember if we tried anything else, but that was definitely one we tried.
So I want to spend a moment on each of the ingredients because you touched at it at a high level, Ted, and maybe we can volley this back and forth in terms of the why behind the selection, right? Because something like methylene blue has many different benefits to human cognition, even in energy. And so if we just go through each of the ingredients, and perhaps we'll start with the most obvious and familiar one, caffeine. Adding caffeine to a nootropic seems quite obvious to a lot of us. Increases awareness, but any other particular reasons that we wanted to have caffeine in there? And, for reminding people here, 50 milligrams of caffeine in a whole troche, which most people take half, is still less than a double espresso.
It's usually 50 milligrams is base it on a cup of coffee. On average is about 200 milligrams of caffeine. So that's really only 1/4 cup of coffee. And when you are taking a half of a troche, that's really only 1/8 cup of coffee. And people are afraid of it. But for me, caffeine can raise your dopamine levels. Dopamine can convert to norepinephrine. And there is your wakefulness, right, which is necessary for focus. That's why it's very good for what I call both a narrow focus and a wide focus, because you need norepinephrine for the wakefulness and you need the dopamine actually to focus you. So, for example, when I'm lecturing here, you can actually focus on your lecture material. And at the same time, you could take a look at a wide focus on your audience to see what the response is. And that for me is the effect of caffeine. And that's really only a very low dose of caffeine, but it's enough, especially if your brain has enough energy to actually do the processing.
Yeah. Along with the synergistic effect of the other ingredients, right? Because I'm always shocked that we have such low doses of all 4 ingredients, really. But somehow, because it's just synergistic, working on different pathways, neurotransmitter systems, you're able to have this significant effect where people take a half of a troche and it's like, holy, my productivity, my focus, it is like that 3 to 5 hours of just being able to get things done. It's pretty amazing.
I want to go into the most controversial of the ingredients that's on the list, which is nicotine. And, nicotine itself, probably a bit demonized. You hinted at an article that was published in Scientific American, Ted, about, I think it was entitled "The Most Misunderstood Nootropic in the World." I've had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Neil Grunberg on this quite a bit, but let's get into nicotine, and I'll volley it over to one of you guys because it is a fascinating nootropic when used appropriately. Probably my favorite single ingredient nootropic. How do we want to look at nicotine as part of Blue Cannatine?
So for nicotine actually raises your acetylcholine in the central nervous system. Acetylcholine is responsible for your memory. And that's why it's in there. And because it has been demonized so much, right? It's highly addicting. But actually, if you take a look at the studies out there, small amounts of nicotine is actually non-addictive. I mean, you have nicotinic acid inside your body. Why are you running away from it? The key here is because of the demonization from cigarettes, which contains not only nicotine, but all the other things that burn in cigarette smoke.
Additives, yeah.
The additives, that's what actually makes it so addictive, right? And besides, there's also an oral fixation, right? You need to have a cigarette in your mouth. That's also a part of the addiction, which you don't have here. Right? So for me, is what's gonna work that I need to actually be on at that particular time. I have a fantastic memory. I have focus. I'm awake and aware, and at the same time, my brain is energized. Right. So that kind of synergy is something that you get from a drug like Adderall. But Adderall is highly addicting. Right. We prescribe it to so many kids. So it's like
and there's shortages.
What's the problem here? And then Boomer, it was really crazy. I had a conversation with a person from the government about this. And they said, well, you have nicotine in there. And then I said, what? You can buy a 4 milligram gum of nicotine, 400 pieces of them in CVS, and you won't bat an eyelash. And here it is, one troche has 1 milligram, and you're saying we can't do it? And he said, well, if you put it that way, right? He said, hello.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to kind of echo that, I mean, a cigarette typically has about 25 milligrams of nicotine per cigarette.
What is a cigar? Double that?
A cigar is 100 milligrams
wow.
of nicotine.
Wow.
Yeah. And if you're vaping, like those vaping vape things, whatever you call them,
the Jewel documentary is very good, by the way.
Yeah. No. So 25 milligrams per hit or something like that. So it's a ridiculous amount. And then your pouches that people get are about 25 to 50 milligrams. So we are using a very low dose here, 1 milligram per full troche. And again, the half dose is typically average for most people. And also, like you said, Ted, I mean, we're not vaping or smoking nicotine either. We're having you slowly dissolve it over 15 to 30 minutes in the buccal cavity, or you can swallow it, as you mentioned as well. So for all those reasons, and I did see some studies on, I think it's about less than 4 milligrams of nicotine per day. It remains in the non-addicting level. And that's in people that were vaping and smoking. I don't think they really check this in other ways. So I think that we're using a very low dose and it's very safe. And the research on mild cognitive impairment, cognitive performance is just out of control.
The single piece gum that you can buy out there actually is 2 milligrams of nicotine.
Yeah. And I remember at one point, you and I in the Philippines were experimenting with some other thing you were concocting, and we were splitting up gum into quarters and stuff like this, just because some of us, myself included, are nicotine sensitive. Now, the one thing, and I mentioned earlier that nicotine is sort of my favorite single ingredient nootropic, and you guys know that I carry around the spray every once in a while with me. The spray contains 1 milligram, but when you spray, there's this reaction, which some people listening to this will remember the bitter beer face commercial. A very similar reaction to what happens when you take nicotine. And if you take nicotine straight, it's a very sharp rise. We introduced a third ingredient here to counteract that rise. Cannabidiol. Who wants to take this one?
That was part of our experimentation before.
Yeah. Yeah, it was one of those things where, as you said, nicotine can give you this kind of fast, jittery feel. And not only is it releasing acetylcholine, but it also affects nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which then allows other neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine to be released as well. So you get this sort of edgy jitteriness. And then if the first time any of you listening have ever tried to smoke a cigarette, you might have vomited like me because it can be very jarring to the system if you're not used to it. So the idea was, how can we create some sort of neuroprotection and some sort of way to kind of counteract some of that stress on the system? Because back in the day when we first started Transcriptions, we also, Dr. Ted, you created different categories of nootropics, because the challenge was nootropics are not all created equal, right? You have ones that can stimulate the system, and you defined as there were two.
Performance optimization nootropics, health optimization nootropics, and then there's a third one, which we can also cover.
The blue
combination.
Yes, yeah. So the performance optimization nootropics in that category were nicotine and caffeine. But we needed things that are also going to support the health of the brain. This is the health optimization nootropic side. And so this was your CBD. And CBD has the capacity to modulate the endocannabinoid system, the internal cannabis system that we have in our brain and our body, and regulating something called anandamide specifically. This is a neurotransmitter that's known derivation of the word is ananda from the Sanskrit word bliss. And what anandamide does is give you more bliss, basically. It makes you feel more blissful. It's neuroprotective. It decreases inflammation. And when you put it in something like Blue Cannatine, what it does is that allows for that slower rise of the effect without that jitteriness. And at the other end of it, it also helps with the slower come down when you finish the 3 to 5 hours of performance optimization with Blue Cannatine.
Voila. Dr. Ted, anything to add on CBD before I kick over? I think we can actually recap some definitions here.
I was really considering using a little bit of THC to increase awareness, to increase a little bit the norepinephrine effect. But, well, it's illegal. So
also, thank you for not doing it, because it would have created a whole host of headaches around, I think it's IRS Rule 280 or something.
We did look into this. We did look into this.
I spent so much time looking at the cannabis industry.
Yeah, I did take a look at it. I had some samples that actually had it. The thing is, THC is so inexpensive because no one wants it. CBD is the one that's expensive.
Let's round out this conversation on ingredients with methylene blue. And this has become somewhat one of our hero ingredients as a company. And to be fair, the first time I came across methylene blue was through you guys. Let's talk about methylene blue. And I think I'll kick it over to Dr. Methylene Blue himself, Dr. Schur. Why don't you kick us off there?
Before I do, actually, Ted, I'm actually trying to remember, because, I mean, methylene blue has been around forever. When did you start actually reading about it and getting interested in it? Because you were the first person to ever mention this compound to me as well.
Yes, I was looking for compounds that can actually rev up the mitochondria very, very quickly, right? I wanted energy production quickly. Over a decade now, someone dubbed me as the mitochondria doctor, and I don't know how that stuck. But one of the things that I love to do, the model that I use of the body really is the structural side and the energetic side. The structural side, we know a lot about it. But the energetic side, we really know so little. I began studying and lecturing about the mitochondria, getting insulted by medical associations that they wouldn't give a continuing medical education credit. Doctors already know about that. It's as if there was no more advances in mitochondria, right? And I found that really extremely insulting. That's why I continued doing this. And the compound I really found very, very effective as an electron donor, right, in mitochondria, which had an immediate effect, was methylene blue. And so I said, I don't care what the status of this is. I said, this is the first ingredient that I was actually going to consider, because when I took it, it lifted my brain fog. When you're jet lagged and you take it, it's like it lifts your brain fog. The quickest one that actually generates energy for you, not only brain energy, but energy for your entire body, was methylene blue. And of course, after all the research, you go through all the rabbit holes. Red Cross uses it as an antiviral for blood together with phototherapy. But those were, for me, the side research. The main thing I was looking at is how to energize the cells in the body. And that's the core of why I actually love methylene blue. I know, Boomer, you were extremely instrumental in us actually developing, educating the market, and now leading the market in terms of methylene blue. And I'm glad we've come to this stage where we're actually right there at the top of educating and actually continuing to serve the market in this way.
It's been an interesting ride, though, man, because methylene blue has taken a lot of education. It has taken a lot of education from the pure social media side of things and getting education out there and talking to the community, but also obviously getting on lecture stages, as I have, and talking to professionals about methylene blue. And it really hasn't been until about a year ago, we've been doing this now for over 4 years, where we really started to see a huge inflection point in people's interest, just more and more people coming our way. I mean, I know we were shocked when we first came out with our pure methylene blue product, which we'll get to another time. But in general, it's been really interesting over the last year or so just to see the huge interest in it from all different types of people. In the beginning, when it was during COVID, we launched the company just a year before the lockdowns and everything. There was different reasons people were using it.
Months before.
Yeah, it's like a month or something. It was crazy. Yeah. But when it comes to methylene blue, what I love about it, it's what's called a redox cycler, which means that it can do what's required, kind of like an adaptogen a little bit for your mitochondria. So it can help you make more energy if you need it. And if you need to help have more detoxification, more antioxidant capacity, it can help you there too. So in Blue Cannatine, what's really great about it is that this very low dose is really just focused on pure mitochondrial optimization. And having that as a supportive became the final category of nootropics that Dr. Ted, you created, which was called a blue tropic, right? One that supported the brain at the same time as it could improve the fitness of a brain, any brain, to really perform a certain task.
Yeah, because that comes from a definition of health and fitness. Health and fitness are really different things. And when you're using a performance optimization nootropic like nicotine, for example, it will tax the brain. So you're overclocking the brain. So before you overclock the brain, make sure that it is healthy first, right? Otherwise, you will get your performance and then you will get sick right afterwards, right? Or your brain
Crash.
cannot
Yeah.
recover very, very quickly. And that's the difference between a health optimization nootropic versus a performance optimization nootropic, right? Your brain is healthy, but it's not fit to do certain things like dog fights, for example, but maybe fit, but it's not healthy because it will just crash afterwards when it's done what it's doing.
So I want to transition now into the discussion around favorite case studies or use cases you've heard for Blue Cannatine. Again, it's been out for a few years now. We have in some ways improved the taste of it, but also over time, we've collected a number of different case studies, feedback. We still get them every day. What's been the favorite ones that you guys have heard?
Scott and I are active medical physicians doing clinics, and I formulated just for myself, and people started to follow because they had focus, etc. But the thing that I was able to do in the clinics, really, even if I don't recommend this to children, the thing that I was really proud about was being able to set up a protocol for those adults who are on Adderall and would like to get off Adderall because it's incredibly addicting. So I had a case of another physician who has been 4 years addicted to Adderall. And within 6 months, we were able to titrate his Adderall dose downwards and increase his Blue Cannatine dose upwards, right? And for me, that's a success story, right? And then now he needs no Adderall and very little Blue Cannatine. If we can just wean off people who actually want to get weaned off Adderall, because Adderall is just really extremely addicting, right? If I had no willpower, I would not wean myself off Adderall. But Adderall has a very sharp feel to it. I'm not knocking Adderall. I mean, it has its uses, right? But for those who would like to get weaned off it, you can, as a physician, you want to take a patient off and the patient wants to be off it, you can devise a protocol of titration downwards of Adderall and upwards of Blue Cannatine. And that for me is my best use of Blue Cannatine. Yeah.
I think that the key is that if you're thinking about stopping a medication, that if you're listening, you really have to do this with a practitioner supervising you, because it's not an easy thing to do. And it's not something that we'd ever recommend you do without somebody working with you very closely. But in those cases, like Dr. Ted, I've had a lot of great successes, and we have a lot of clinicians that work with us that have had those kinds of successes in a similar frame. The other area that I've seen a lot of benefit in people that have had post-infectious kinds of mitochondrial dysfunction. There's going to be any kind of infection you can imagine, anything from your molds, your Lymes, your COVIDs and things like that. Like, we're not treating those. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that after you have those kinds of things, your mitochondria are often pretty messed up. And it takes a while for you to get better. And the brain fog, the fatigue, the concentration problems can be real. And so just adding a little bit of this has done significant work to helping people recover. And I've seen a lot of this over and over again over the last 4 years. And even if people that don't have any issues, really, like they have a pretty good mind, they feel like they're pretty motivated most of the time. And what's the average attention span of most people now? It's about like 2.5 seconds or something like that, right? So take some Blue Cannatine and it's going to increase your concentration, your focus for 3 to 5 hours. So that's going to help almost anybody that is living in the world where TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat are right on your phone and you keep swiping like Boomer does, so.
I'm not on TikTok, but
well,
for this exact reason.
Before they would go to the gym, right? They would take half a Blue Cannatine.
Yeah, they work out for sure.
Before they go work out, and they have a more focused workout and, a little bit stronger.
I think because you guys touched on a lot of the clinical applications, and I guess these are kind of clinical, but more on the performance side of it. You do see people taking a half before the gym, of course. A lot of the feedback that I saw among athletes that I talked to was around endurance, and in particular, a half, allowing them to either pace a workout better, pace a marathon better. That seemed to work really well. And then the one story that I'm reminded of is a friend who's in private equity, and he's in the position in his career where he's responsible for sourcing deals. And in a private equity deal, when you go out and buy a company, his job is to effectively figure out where the holes are. What is he not seeing? What could potentially cause the whole deal to go bust? And he says that Blue Cannatine is the best thing for him to do on the weekend before essentially the committee meeting where they make the decision to buy the company, because he's able to see patterns or perhaps see things in a different way, and it allows him to be a more effective decision maker. So just a couple of clinical performance related benefits of Blue Cannatine too.
Lots of great stories. We've had it out in the market now for 4.5 years. And the cool thing about it is it's titratable like the rest of our products. So you can start with a quarter, go to a half or full. If you're at a conference, we usually recommend a full. Just kidding. You're already overstimulated at those things anyway.
I've only tried a full once, and I'm not a heavy caffeine user, but I use caffeine regularly, or used to.
That's the benefit of a troche. It's scored into quarters and you could quarter them. And being trained in pharmacology, I'd like to know exactly what dose is getting into my patient, right? Even though we are a formula, I still handle our troches like bona fide drugs themselves, right? The safety of the person who's actually taking it. They know exactly how much they're taking. Even Scott, you remember, I even insisted right from the start that this would have child-proof packaging.
Yes, people hate us for that.
Child-proof packaging. And the first packaging that came out was really expensive because it was like plastic and so on. It was very good looking, but it was really very expensive. That's the way I wanted our formulas handled, right? With the respect and deference that we have, that we do when we're actually handling a drug.
Well, we have a moniker for that: precision dosed, physician formulated pharmaceutical grade. Similar to, I think it was Tchaikovsky's first concerto, right? It took 3 years to get going. We're getting going here. Any final words before we round out this and dismount this podcast?
All the research and all the information that I have on Blue Cannatine, I put together in some complex lecture or lectures, and then Dr. Scott gladly accepted them and transformed them into something that is actually chewable,
digestible.
Somebody can actually understand.
That contributed a lot, not only to the success of Blue Cannatine, but really in terms of the leadership of ours in the area of methylene blue. Dr. Scott is now called Dr. Methylene Blue, right? He's
you can almost, if you're watching this on video, you can see him blushing right now.
Yeah,
and it's so nice now that when we're in a booth together, I'm totally ignored, and they go, "Oh, I wanted to talk to Dr. Scott about methylene blue." Like, okay, that's perfectly fine with me. He's now more knowledgeable than I am because he's done a lot more research on it, and most of all, he's done a lot more translation, right? And that's really beneficial to all users of the product.
There's tons of blogs on the website on all of the ingredients, multiple blogs on nicotine, tons on methylene blue, CBD, caffeine. It's all there for people to listen, read, and tons of more information on the website you guys can check out too if you're interested.
Everybody, have a wonderful day.